offensive capabilities as well to defend ourselves in the event of a cyber war. Now, that is a perfect quote. It sums up the problem decisively. Right, so when we talk about defining cyber warfare, there's a debate amongst cybersecurity experts as to what kind of activity constitutes cyber warfare. Some people say it's when lives are lost. Others say it's when it crosses a certain threshold. Basically, the answer is that we can all agree is that cyber warfare typically is against a state entity. And it results in, or can result in, a disruption of critical systems, sometimes even loss of life. So I just want to quickly touch on 7 types of cyber warfare attacks. I think a lot of these have been covered before, so I'm not going to go into great detail. Basically, espionage is spying, right? We all know that happens regularly, specifically with state actors. So there are things like botnets, spear phishing attacks, and normally it's a compromise of sensitive computer systems before exfiltration happens, right? So typically that's what would happen. There would be some sort of spying, there would be exfiltration of data, and it would be for either financial or for political gain. We have sabotage. Sabotage basically is a risk that government institutions and governments face whether it's hostile governments or whether it is terrorists. They are capable of stealing information and they can destroy it, or they can leverage insider threats such as dissatisfied or careless employees. Right, the next one is denial of service attacks. We all know about denial of service attacks, what they are. The most common ones are DDoS attacks, so the distributed denial of service attacks. There are even cyber criminals that go about making a business model out of this. We have a crowd called DD4BC, which is DDoS for Bitcoin. They are capable of generating over 600 gigs of distributed denial of service attacks by harvesting bots and attacking targeted destinations. And they, of course, do that for financial gain. The next one is electrical or power grid. So we're talking about attacking infrastructure. And this is a very critical one for governments. Right. Attacks like this can disrupt governments, it can basically destabilize countries, and it can render communications unusable. We have propaganda attacks. So this is designed to affect the minds of people. We like to think of it as people hacking, right? We can make people either follow our way of thought. I mean, one of the previous speakers was speaking about ISIS, who used very, very well used propagation or propaganda attacks to further their own ideological beliefs. It can make people lose trust in the country or side with the country's enemies. We have economic disruption. I think everybody understands economic disruption. It happens daily. I heard a very scary figure by the last speaker who literally around the amount or the number of people that were affected by economic attacks in one day. It is really terrifying. And then we have surprise attacks. Now, surprise attacks are really interesting. They're the equivalent of 9/11 in the US or Pearl Harbor from the Japanese, right? And it's where an attacker uses something like a cyber attack to weaken a country's defenses. And then they normally follow that up by an actual ground attack. And that can obviously reach a situation where the country is completely destabilized, the armed forces are in disarray, and they are able to actually win a war. So basically to that end, what we have is some examples, and I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm just going to list them. Right, Stuxnet. Everyone understands Stuxnet. Stuxnet was an attack on the Iranian nuclear system. Right, we have Sony Pictures hack. In the Sony Pictures hack, basically Sony Pictures released a movie or a film which depicted Kim Jong-un in a bad light, so North Korea, and it was really, they ended up with a sustained attack on their infrastructure, which pretty much, although there's no real proof, it can be tied back to a state actor attacking a corporation. We have Bronze Soldier. Bronze Soldier is literally Estonia. Estonia had a statue of a soldier, which they relocated from the center of town to a cemetery, and they sustained serious attacks in the wake of that, so much so that it took all their government systems down. So websites, payment systems, literally huge swaths of infrastructure was taken down during the Bronze Soldier attack. Another one is Fancy Bear. Everybody's heard of Fancy Bear. It's the name of an APT, but it was named after a Russian cyber criminal group called Fancy Bear, funny enough. And this was a particularly very devastating attack for Ukraine. And we all know what's happening. This was around about 2014, during the Crimea War, and Ukraine had a bunch of D-30 howitzers, which are anti-aerial attack cannons, and they were controlled by an Android application. This specifically targeted Android applications, and the Ukrainian officers, they made wide use of this application, and what was happening is they installed a thing called Agent X malware, and it literally ended up being such a successful attack that it ended up with the destruction of over 80% of Ukraine's D-30 howitzers, right? So this is the kind of impact that you can expect during cyber war. The last one is enemies of Qatar, and this is just a really interesting one. Elliot Brody, he is a Republican in the US, and he was a fundraiser for the Republican Party in the US, and he accused Qatar in 2018 of stealing and leaking his emails, pretty much to discredit him. And the reason for that was they felt that he was portraying them in a bad light, and they didn't want to look bad in front of Washington. And so pretty much the lawsuit says that the Qatari leadership was attacking 1,200 people. So 1,200 people were literally targeted in this attack. So, really interesting. These are all examples of a very large scale cyber war. We have challenges facing government, right? So most people focus on financial loss. So they say, okay, well, government's being attacked, it's financial, right? But there are a couple of problems, and I'm going to go through them just at a really high level. There is the impact of cyber incidents on governments, right? We've covered a lot of that. There are vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities, basically, if you think about what's happening with bring your own devices, and if you think about what's happening with the fact that personal PDAs, people are walking around with phones, right? Okay, who doesn't? How many people walk with phones, connect to the company Wi-Fi or connect to the government Wi-Fi, right? All of these PDAs, all these personal devices are potential sources of attack. Right, so the expanding range of devices and the use of personal devices are big problems. We have underfunded training and skills, and this is where, for example, cyber range becomes a big player, right? We have the availability of hacking resources. You can log on to Kali.org and you can download an entire hacking platform, right? Anyone can do it. It is easily available. There are tons of informational videos for people on how to do it. Now, because of the availability of this kind of stuff, clearly it adds to the problem, right? Poor cyber hygiene is another one. So there we have threats. Threats can be constituted of cyber criminals, hacktivists, terrorist groups, insider threats. And insider threats include malicious and non-malicious insider threats. And what I mean by that is somebody doesn't have to actively be trying to attack your infrastructure, right? They can do it A, by mistake, or B, unwittingly and unknowingly, right? They can be given, and this is a well-known attack mechanism. People will use a thumb drive, like one that I have in my pocket, right? They could leave the thumb drive lying in a parking lot somewhere. Someone can pick up the thumb drive. It could have malware installed in it. You can go into the building, plug it into a PC thinking, well, I want to see what's on it, and end up infecting the infrastructure, right? These are all threats. One of the biggest problems that we have, though, is a poor understanding of threats, and this speaks to that. People who don't understand the kind of impact that a threat can have, right, contribute to the problem. And then we have things like underfunding, and I'm sure everybody that works for the government understands underfunding, right? It is a very common problem. And what I mean by that is we need to understand that as we roll out more and more systems, and those systems have got new software, new interfaces, new functionality, all of these are potential risks waiting to happen. When we don't increase our spend on cybersecurity or our investment in cybersecurity, right, and we expect that we're going to have the same level of risk that we had before, we are sadly mistaken. We need to appreciate that, and please do not misunderstand. I don't believe that covering a problem with money is going to fix the problem. It doesn't do that. But if we do not adequately recognize the fact that we need to ensure that systems stay up to date and are adequately secured, we will always have this problem. Right. So let's go to operations. So one of the things that we can that occur in cyber warfare operations is conducting risk assessments with cyber war games. And to do this, we can do a couple of things, right? One of them is testing different situations. So, and this is important. It's somewhere where a cyber range shines, is the ability to create an environment where we can conduct risk assessments safely, securely, and isolated, and it won't affect the rest of your network. You can test different situations. You can test unusual situations, and that's very important, right? A cyber range, for example, needs to be able to adapt, and it needs to be able to run unusual variations of outcomes. What I mean by that is an attack is not always scripted. It doesn't always happen in exactly the same way. If we look at the cyber kill chain, so Lockheed Martin created the cyber kill chain, and if we look at the cyber kill chain, it defines a number of stages. In the Lockheed Martin model, there are 7 stages, but in those stages there are what we call TTPs, right? Techniques, tactics, and procedures, right? And these enable attackers to infiltrate and do things at different levels of the kill chain. Now, when it comes to that sort of thing, not every path to the end goal is typically exfiltration. So the very last piece would be getting data, because you don't hack somebody without an end goal. The end goal is typically exfiltration or some kind of financial gain, if you like, but the end goal or the path to the end goal doesn't have to follow the same path. It isn't always a spear phishing attack followed by a piece of malware. That's one specific kind of malware that gets installed, followed by a attack on a web server, followed by fetching information via FTP, exploiting some kind of vulnerability, doing